Note to the reader. This is the first of a three-part series centering on my personal remembrance of Charan Singh, 1916 to 1990, who was the spiritual leader of Radha Swami Satsang Beas from 1951 to 1990. As such, it isn't a biography, but rather partial glimpses of my own recollection of how I came to know of Charan and why I eventually took initiation from him into the meditational practice of Surat Shabd Yoga. I realize that much of what I write here is of a deeply personal nature and reflects more on my own life trajectory and perceptions than providing an objective look at Charan's life and work. I didn't write this as a devotional eulogy to my deceased spiritual teacher, but more selfishly, as a way for me to write down key moments of my association with him, both when he was alive and after his death, for over 4 decades. The motivation for doing this primarily stems from my desire to provide a readable narrative for my 2 boys, Sean and Kelly, since they know precious little about my early life and why I meditate so much today, and why I have been strict vegetarian for over 45 years. This narrative may also partially explain, given my erstwhile skepticism of most things religious, why I strongly believe in the Jain concepts of ahimsa and anekantavada, non-violence and multiple points of view, respectively. For a more detailed explanation of these twin concepts, see the following films: The 2-Minute Warning, Jainism and the Practice of Non-Violence, and Anekantavada, the Jain Concept of Multiple World Views, both featured on my Neural Surfer Vision YouTube channel. While I have a long track record of being particularly hypercritical of cults and paranormal claims in general, I also have a deep love and fondness for subjectively exploring the depths of my own consciousness. Thus, I don't think mysticism, in the positive sense of that term as a moniker for private contemplation, and science as a communicative method for objectively questioning and testing differing models, are mutually exclusive. To the contrary, I think science can be of a great assistance in our spiritual voyages, since it helps us not to be too easily mesmerized or duped by our internal machinations. I realize that what I write in the following pages may be regarded as a bit heretical by those who have a more fundamentalist view of Radhaswami and Sant Mat theology. My spelling of certain Indian terms is idiosyncratic. The Agra Satsangs, Dayal Bagh, Swami Bagh, and Pipal Mandi spell the term Radha Swami as one word, whereas the Beas Satsangs, and some Satsangs that branched off from them, separate the 2 words as Radha Swami. My own preference is to retain the Agra preferred spellings whenever possible. To this charge, I must confess to being guilty. While it is certainly true that I have the deepest admiration for Charan Singh and Shabd Yoga, I don't necessarily agree with all of his views and actions, nor do I believe in all of the theology that has, in my opinion, encrusted much of Radhaswami teachings over the years. I think we are all better off retaining our critical faculties when aligning ourselves with any path, be it secular or spiritual. Jagat Singh, 1884 to 1951, a respected chemistry professor and the guru who appointed Charan Singh as his successor, is famously quoted as saying that 90% of spirituality is clear thinking. This is an adage that has served me well over the years. Often, gurus in India are more widely known by their honorifics than by their birth names. This is especially true in Radhaswami and Sant Mat circles, where most masters are referred to by such exalted titles as Hazur, Maharaj, Sant, Baba, and Master. I have consciously avoided indulging in such appellatives and have opted to simply use first and last names whenever possible. This, too, may cause some consternation among certain devotees who may find my informality to be a lack of respect. I beg to differ, since what makes a human being special or extraordinary has nothing to do with what titles we confer on him or her, but rather how they have lived and conducted their lives. I believe there is far too much hyperbole and gross exaggeration when it comes to describing our beloved teachers, masters, and gurus. We have tended to elevate our Ishtadevas to such rarefied heights of glory that we have neglected and forgotten that they are human beings and prone to mistakes and errors in judgments just like us. It is hubris to hold that these masters are perfect. As Nietzsche was not shy of pointing out about leaders of the past, they are all human, all too human. While certain quarters may view this as sacrilegious, I think the opposite is true. I suggest we can better appreciate our assorted gurus by first acknowledging their limitations instead of elevating them to godlike statuses. Granted, these present views of mine took time to mature, since when I was young I too was caught up in the lofty rhetoric that embellishes much of spiritual literature. This has been, in many ways, the most difficult writing project I have ever embarked on, because it is so personal and so close to my heart. I have tried my best to give an outline of my association with Charan, though knowing full well that the deeper part of how I feel about him and my own internal search hasn't gone below the surface. This particular installment only covers the first 22 years of my life and culminates with my formal initiation into the sound current practice on November 26, 1978. The second part will focus on the intervening 12 years up until Charan Singh's death on June 1, 1990, and will describe my repeated trips to the Dera, Delhi, and Mumbai. The last and third part will center on what transpired for the last 30 years between 1990 and 2020. Preface. June 1, 1990. It was a phone call I never wanted to receive. Paul Tua, an old friend from Yucca Valley in the desert, informed me that our spiritual mentor, Charan Singh, had died. The telephone rang very early that morning, and I knew before answering it that something was amiss. Paul had gotten word directly from India just hours after Charan Singh's death from a heart condition was announced. He was only 73.5 years old. I was completely distraught, as I was deeply attached to Charan, having first come into contact with him when I was barely 17 years old. It was a Friday, and I had to teach an early morning class at Mount San Antonio College, where I had been hired the year before as a full-time philosophy professor. Since I was then living in Del Mar, California, it took me 2 hours to get to school. I still remember arriving early at my office, and waiting outside my door was Michelle Lopez, a young student of mine who had been serving for the past few months as my teaching assistant. She looked like she had been crying and appeared not to have slept. I hadn't told her the news about my teacher's death, and so I asked her what was wrong. Michelle replied, "Dave, I had the most unusual thing happen to me last night while I was driving home. It was late at night, and I was on the 101 freeway when, all of a sudden, I was blinded by a white light, and I felt my body turn numb. I immediately turned off the road. As I parked my car, with the engine still running, I had a vision that your guru, Charan Singh, had died. It incapacitated me." Then Michelle looked directly at me with tears in her eyes, asking plaintively, "It's not true, is it, Dave? Charan Singh didn't die, right?" When I explained that, yes, it is true, I just heard a few hours earlier that he had passed, Michelle broke down. Almost unbelievably, her vision was true, and she had hoped it wasn't. I was wonderstruck by Michelle's experience, since she had not heard that Charan had died, as I was one of the first persons in the United States to learn of the news. Michelle was in a state of shock because her vision of Charan's passing correlated almost exactly to the time he died in India, which was 12.5 hours ahead of California's time zone. I proceeded to ask Michelle to describe her encounter in more detail. She had gone to see a woman guru that night in Los Angeles, and after the satsang, drove home by herself when unexpectedly she was overcome by a blaze of light and an unmistakable feeling of presence. She pulled off the freeway, frightened and also mesmerized by what was happening to her, and then was embraced by that same light and informed that Charan Singh had died. Michelle went home that night and had trouble sleeping, and thus got up early to come to my office at Mount San Antonio College to share what had transpired. I was so sad that day I didn't really think too much about Michelle's vision and how improbable it seemed until much later when my emotions settled down. Michelle was an unusual student, and we had gotten to know each other a few months prior. Around that time, I saw her before class, looking very depressed and just gazing over the railing of the second floor in our humanities building. I interrupted her and asked, "What's got you down, Michelle?" She looked up and surprised me by saying, "You know something about life and its meaning, but are not sharing it with the class. Why not?" I shook my head and replied, "What? I don't have any inside secrets to the universe." To which she added, "I am longing for something I don't fully understand, and I think you may have knowledge about it that may help me in my quest." Not wanting to talk about my own spiritual path, being too personal and a bit too complicated to explain quickly, I said, "Well, there are books on Eastern philosophy that may help." Michelle immediately grasped at the suggestion and asked what books did I like at her age. Call of the Great Master. I had a book in my office that I thought might be helpful and also might distract her, even if only temporarily, from inquiring about my own practice. It was written by Daryai Lal Kapoor and gives a moving and romantic retelling of his life with Charan Singh, a Shabd yoga master in India who died in 1948. The title was Call of the Great Master. I didn't really think Michelle would read the book, or if she did, it would take her a month or so, given the intensity of her course load. I was wrong. The very next day, Michelle came into my classroom and said she stayed up all night reading the book and exclaimed unequivocally that this is precisely what she was looking for. Not exactly sure how to respond, I explained that the best course would be for her to write a letter to Charan Singh, the grandson and eventual successor of Charan Singh at Radhaswami Satsang Beas. She did so that very night. This was in late April of 1990. The last letter. I mention all this as a prelude because on the day both Michelle and I officially learned that Charan died, I asked her if she ever got a letter back from him. She replied, "No, nothing has come in the mail." "That's too bad," I responded. Yet, a full 2 weeks later, as I was getting ready to go through the commencement ceremonies at Mount San Antonio College, Michelle came running up to me, terribly excited, exclaiming, "You won't believe this, but I just got a letter from Charan Singh from India." "What? That's impossible. He is dead," I blurted out, not sure why I was so abrupt. Michelle went on to explain, "My brother went to the mailbox today and he thought the blue aerogram from India was some sort of junk mail and threw it in the trash can. Luckily, I happened to look in the trash and found it. Can you believe it? It could have been lost forever if I hadn't for some reason looked in the trash can." "What did he say, Michelle?" I queried. "He mentioned your name, Professor, and on the bottom there is a note saying that the master died before being able to sign the letter." I was shocked and requested to get a copy of the letter as soon as possible. Michelle was quite an unusual person and a woman with very strong intuitions. I say this because a year or so after this, Michelle asked me to be the godfather to her newborn child, saying cryptically that she knew her time was short and that it was destined that she would die at a very young age in a car accident. This irritated me, and I reprimanded her, arguing that, "Don't think that way and don't hold such thoughts." But she looked at me, clear-eyed and without hesitation. "I know you don't want to hear such things from me, but I know in my heart it is my destiny." And so it was. After dropping off her newborn daughter with her family, Michelle was driving her car when a drunk driver ran a red light and killed her instantly. Everyone who knew her, especially her family, was devastated when they heard the news. Michelle's subsequent funeral was the saddest one I have ever attended in my life, not only because she was so young, but also because she was such a bright and lovable human being who gave kindness and warmth to all who knew her. I gave a little talk at her funeral, but was so overcome with emotion that I made little sense, except to say that Michelle was a shining jewel and would never be forgotten by anyone who was blessed to know her. While I readily concede that Michelle's visionary experience, dovetailing as it did with CHARAN's passing, is particularly remarkable, I think it is important to see if it can be explained rationally, without invoking supernatural causation. The real difficulty, I would argue, is being critically analytical of our own numinous or borderline encounters. Richard Feynman, the distinguished physicist at Caltech, rightly cautioned years ago, "The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." Looking more objectively, and with an eye for untold details concerning Charan Singh's death and Michelle's extraordinary vision, could there possibly be a more sedate explanation for what occurred? I think so, even if those believers inclined for the miraculous will still hold on to its seemingly paranormal implications. First, was there any reason for Michelle to believe, prior to her vision, that Charan's life expectancy was coming to a close? Yes. I myself had long worried that he would not live much longer. I thought this not because I was psychic, far from it, but because I saw some telltale signs in Charan's own behavior, not the least of which was his rushed publication, Treasure Beyond Measure, that revealed for the first time in print very personal details about how he assumed the mastership and his frank admissions about feeling unworthy of such a position. He also opened up the Dera colony to all visitors from around the world, something he had never done before. I imagine that I would have conveyed some of my thoughts about Charan's unprecedented actions to Michelle. Furthermore, Michelle had sent her letter to Charan sometime in April, and, given his legendary punctuality, she may have wondered about the absence of a timelier response. Interestingly, the night that Michelle had her vision of Charan's demise, she had just attended a spiritual talk by a woman guru from India and was driving home when she was overwhelmed by her spiritual revelation. I realize that elaborating on these contextual details may be unsatisfactory, but it does underline an important issue inherent in these supernatural recollections. The more information we know about them, the better informed we will be about adjudicating their alleged transpersonal veridicality. The Quest. Childhood longing. Michelle's longing for something transcendent is one that many of us share. I particularly felt it from early on in my childhood. Much of why this is the case, I suspect, stems from how we were raised and how well we adapted, or didn't, to our particular circumstances. Everyone I know who is brought up in a strict Catholic tradition, going to church, attending parochial schools, receiving communion and confirmation, is irredeemably infected by its theological ideas, even if later they contravene them in varying ways. I say this precisely because, from a very early age, I suffered from a severe longing for something transcendent, what in German is known as Sehnsucht, properly defined as thoughts and feelings about all facets of life that are unfinished or imperfect, paired with a yearning for ideal alternative experiences. It has been referred to as life's longings, or an individual's search for happiness while coping with the reality of unattainable wishes. I suspect that almost all human beings have at one time or another felt a sense of longing that couldn't be resolved by what the world has on offer. In any case, I remember very early on feeling a profound absence, even though I was surrounded by 3 loving siblings and a coterie of good childhood friends. The problem with Catholicism was that it didn't offer me an experiential solution to my difficulties, but, on the whole, only exacerbated it with its overriding emphasis on sin, suffering, and ritualism, not to mention an unbending dogmatism concerning unknowable mysteries such as the resurrection of Christ and the virginity of his mother. Thus, it is not surprising that I was open to alternative views while still very young. Reflecting back now, I can vividly recall first practicing yoga when I was 10 years old. I was undoubtedly a product of my age, or perhaps of what was on television, since I was mesmerized by Richard Hittelman's popular show Yoga for Health, which reportedly debuted on local television in Los Angeles, California in 1961. I used to visit weekly the North Hollywood Public Library that had a few books on yoga, and from those few rudimentary texts I started practicing pranayama, breath control, asanas, body postures, and mudras, hand positions. In the midst of these self-taught exercises, I happened to watch the Les Crane television show with my mother. I think it was in the afternoon, and Mr. Crane was interviewing Maharishi Mahesh Yogi for nearly an hour, and my mom and I were thoroughly moved by it. I particularly liked the guru's emphasis on stilling the mind. I mention this because, although I was not personally drawn to the Maharishi, the idea of meditation struck a chord with me. At this tender age of 11 years old, I also chanced upon Paramahansa Yogananda's famous book, Autobiography of a Yogi. I was enthralled with it and couldn't put the book down, reading it very carefully each day. Ironically, I wasn't looking for a book on yoga when I came upon Yogananda's famous text. Rather, I was obsessively interested in baseball, and when I first saw the title, I thought it was about the sports life of Yogi Berra, the famous catcher for the New York Yankees. I soon realized my error, but I delved into the book nevertheless and was riveted from the first page onwards. I think this particular book must have been the tipping point, as it has been a touchstone for many people worldwide, including Steve Jobs, who allegedly had it on his own personal iPad and reread it yearly. Yogananda's tale is a fantastic one and not always a believable one. But being indoctrinated within Catholicism and its innumerable miraculous stories concerning saints and the like, I was overly ripe for the offering. I coupled my Indian philosophical reading with biographies of Catholic saints and mystics. I was particularly enamored with Saint John Bosco, who had visions of the Virgin Mary. In one story, which I now think must be part of some questionable hagiographical rendition, Saint John Bosco went to church and offered his lunch, or was it an apple, to a statue of the Virgin Mary, and it came alive and took it. For some strange reason this appealed to me, and I used to go to our St. Charles Church, which also housed the elementary school I attended, and very intently offered my lunch to the statue of the Virgin Mary. When that didn't work, I tried offering it to the statue of Saint Joseph, again to no avail. Thankfully, this miracle-seeking on my part was short-lived, and I dived more deeply into my yogic studies and practice. I also branched out and started reading about the life of Buddha. One night I was so taken by Siddhartha's firm resolution to sit under the Bodhi tree until he reached enlightenment that I got out of bed. It was a school night, of course, and I crossed my legs and sat on the floor and vowed not to get up until I too received illumination. Of course, given my monkey mind, I think it took all of but 10 minutes for me to contemplate getting some cereal and watching some television instead. I became an obsessive reader of all things Eastern. At the age of 15, I had a remarkable experience of speaking in tongues when I attended a charismatic mass at Loyola University near Manhattan Beach that convinced me that higher states of consciousness were possible without ingesting drugs. As my quest intensified, I eventually turned vegetarian at the age of 16 and consciously looked for a spiritual guide who could instruct me further on the inner journey. Although I met a number of teachers, including the infamous Father Yod and Yogi Bhajan, among others, I developed a peculiar standard with which to appraise any potential master. I ruminated to myself that he must be a vegetarian and follow a path of ahimsa, or non-violence. He must not charge any money whatsoever for instruction and not make any absolute claims about his own inner attainment. And, finally, and I am fairly sure that the Sikh influence here, though not conscious, was operative, the teacher should have an uncut hair and beard. To be sure, this very guru template was influenced by what I was reading and what I was experiencing, and says much about how persuasively our own cultural upbringing flavors our inner sojourns, contrary to what we may mistakenly believe to be a pure and virginal quest for the absolute. It was in fall of 1973 that I found myself at an existential crossroads. Although outwardly my life was enviable, I had a girlfriend, I was surfing, I had good friends, I felt acutely sad and longed for something transcendent, but my search hadn't borne any fruit. I distinctly remember one night lying in the back seat of my car uncontrollably crying for hours, feeling quite lonely and forlorn. I prayed, asking God and the universe for a spiritual teacher who I could trust. I hadn't prayed that intensely ever, and I remember being completely empty and exhausted. Luckily, that night I had the most peaceful sleep in my life. I woke up the next morning completely refreshed with a curious and anxious sense that everything was going to work out. 2 restaurants and 1 significant coincidence. Just a few days later, or was it that very day, I was having lunch at the Magic Apple Cafe in Burbank, which was quite popular in those days for its non-meat options and a wickedly good smoothie. On my table, I had placed a piece of paper with the Sikh chant Ek Onkar Sat Nam Siri Wa Guru, which I had picked up previously from an earlier yoga session I had attended. This Sikh chant came from Yogi Bhajan's 3HO movement, which was popular around the time because it offered various classes on Kundalini yoga and also ran a strict vegetarian restaurant called Golden Temple Conscious Cookery. Our waiter was a very friendly fellow, clearly interested in those he was serving, and after looking down at my paper, struck up a conversation with me about spiritual matters. I explained that I was in search of an enlightened teacher, but that I didn't think they existed anymore. I mentioned my admiration for Ramakrishna and Ramana Maharshi, though both were long dead. My waiter, who I later learned went by the name Lee, looked at me whimsically as if he held a deep secret that he wasn't about to spill out to a naive teenager. But I was a persistent kid, so Lee eventually just said one thing to me that he wrote down on the napkin. Just remember the name Radha Swami. And with that cryptic remark, I left the restaurant not quite sure what such a term meant, since I didn't fully comprehend what it actually meant. Later that night, I heard from a close friend that there was an older Catholic gentleman who owned a small restaurant in North Hollywood called Johnny's Little Dining Room, which was near my old elementary school, St. Charles. His name was Johnny Haddad, and even though he was brought up strictly Catholic and even sang choir occasionally at church, he was intensely interested in Eastern philosophy and had been following a spiritual path for years. My friend suggested that I should go meet him, since he allegedly had found a genuine guru from India who had initiated him into a certain yogic practice. Feeling an odd sense of providence, I went to the restaurant, but it was closed, so I decided to go nearer to lunchtime the next day. As I walked into the small dining room, Johnny, who was also the main cook, came out from the back kitchen and with folded hands greeted me with an affectionate Radha Swami. Something later he said he never did to strangers, given that his restaurant catered to the local business clientele and had a varied menu which included meat. Right at that moment, something happened that I cannot accurately describe. It was not merely the coincidence of hearing the name Radhaswamy again at two different restaurants, but with the same name getting repeated, but rather an overwhelming sensation overtook my body and my mind that convinced me that something magical was happening. I immediately asked Johnny to show me a picture of his spiritual teacher. He led me back to the kitchen, where he had hung a portrait of his guru, Charan Singh, who was sitting on a wicker chair, smiling with his hands folded in a relaxed gesture. Coincidentally, when I had my first private interview with Charan Singh at the Dera in Beas, Punjab, India, in December of 1981 in his office, the table behind him had the very same photograph that I had seen at Johnny's restaurant. Given that there are literally thousands of photographs of Charan Singh, it was a nice, even if explainable, coincidence. The very moment I saw the photograph, I knew that this was destined to be my guide. I didn't know anything about him or what he taught, but something mystical, for want of a better term, occurred that even some 45 years later, it is impossible for me to put into words. It was the oddest sense of certainty I had ever experienced, as if recognizing a best friend from years past and reuniting once again. I was ecstatic. Thankfully, Johnny filled in some details for me and explained that Charan Singh didn't charge money, was a lifelong vegetarian, advocated ahimsa, and didn't regard himself as a master, since he was more or less forced to assume the position due to his predecessor's orders. Ironically, Charan Singh, being raised within a Sikh culture, also hadn't cut his hair or beard. What I didn't expect, however, was that Radha Swami teachings were focused on Surat Shabd Yoga, where one's meditation is centered on hearing a beautiful inner sound, which pulls one's attention inward and upward. Philosophically, I was more aligned with the Advaita Vedanta position, as espoused by Ramana Maharshi, which advocates a non-dual perspective. The idea of listening to an inner music sounded, and the pun is intentional here, strange to me, but I knew I had to look deeper into the subject. That very night, after I had left Johnny's little dining room, I drove to my favorite bookstore in West Hollywood, the now-defunct Bodhi Tree on Melrose Avenue, since I suspected, rightly, that they would have some books on Radhaswamy philosophy. As I perused the store, which was actually a renovated small house, I came upon several interesting titles, such as Call of the Great Master, The Path of the Masters, With a Great Master in India. Yet none of these had detailed sections on Charan Singh, but rather focused on Sawan Singh, his grandfather and guru. Only one book had material on Charan Singh, and that was the third volume of Rai Sahib Munshi Ram's diary, With the Three Masters. I bought the book and read it over the next day, concentrating on the latter sections that detailed how Charan Singh was appointed by his predecessor Jagat Singh in late 1951. Coincidentally, 44 years later, when I went to North India on a research project for Oxford University Press, the publication team at the Dera asked me to review a new edition of With the Three Masters, since they had been working on a new translation in English of the diaries. The new edition was chock full with new information, including that Fakir Chand had himself given satsang during Sawan Singh's tenure during the mid-1940s. What impressed me most then, and still does today, is Charan Singh's utter shock and sadness at being appointed a guru by Jagat Singh. He clearly didn't want the position and tried his best to extricate himself from it. As Charan explained in his diary entry about October 22nd, 1951, I was shocked and surprised to find Sardar Bahadurji's order for me. People surrounded me, and one after another, everybody had his way. I hardly knew what to do. I have never felt so bad and so ashamed as I felt then. I was feeling as if I had committed some heinous crime of my life and had been punished with the sentence of death, and people just surrounded me to see my execution. It was terrible for me to spend 3 hours there. Destiny could hardly play a worse joke than this. I knew I was not what I was taken to be, and yet I could not find any way out of this. This was a guru I knew I could trust, since he didn't regard himself as a master and felt he was completely unworthy of holding such an exalted title. As I read more and more books on the subject, I got a clearer idea about who Charan Singh was and the Radhaswami path. Essentially, Radhaswami arose from the teachings of Sant Mat, an eclectic group of Nirguna Bhakti poets predominant in North India, who argued that God was to be found within and nowhere else. They emphasized devotion, high moral living, and steadfast meditation. Central to their teachings was the concept of Shabd and Nam, whereby the neophyte repeats a sacred mantra and then listens to subtler and subtler inner sounds, which is accompanied by various gradations of inner light. By attaching one's attention to the light and sound within, the meditator follows the source of his or her consciousness back to its terminal apex, and thus achieves both self and God realization. To my chagrin, I found out that there was a plethora of Gaudiya Nashin lineages that originated from the modern founder of Radhaswami, Shiv Dayal Singh, 1818 to 1878. Thus, there were many gurus, each claiming to be the rightful heir and interpreter of modern Sant Mat. Although there were slight variances in the different satsangs, they all agreed upon 4 key requisites. 1. A lacto-vegetarian diet. 2. High moral living. 3. No drugs or alcohol. And 4. Daily meditation based on repeating a sacred mantra, focusing attention at the third eye, and listening to an inner sound current. The master of each of these lineages was believed to have the ability to initiate disciples into the path and help them on their inner spiritual journey. But getting initiated meant that the neophyte must be willing to commit to a strict lifestyle, where meditating 2.5 hours daily was given elemental importance. There are a number of academic histories on Radhaswami. Outstanding among these are Mark Juergensmeyer's Radhaswami Reality, Princeton University Press, 1991, Om Prakash Kaushal's The Radhaswami Movement, ABS Publications, 1998. I also did my MA thesis and PhD dissertation on guru succession and politics, parts of which were incorporated in my 1992 book, The Radhaswami Tradition, A Critical History of Guru Succession, London and New York, Garland Publishers. I was not put off by these strictures, since I was already conversant with yoga and meditation, and, given my father's nearly lifelong alcoholism, I didn't drink or take drugs. Yet all this was secondary to my real focus, which was my deep pull and attraction to Charan Singh as my spiritual mentor. It is nearly impossible to explain why this was so without sounding cliched or trite. Perhaps the best and most apt analogy is that of falling in love with someone and not being able to precisely articulate why. It just happens, and our biochemistry is such that it triggers a severely emotional resonance throughout one's being, as if curing a lifelong hurt. From the moment I learned about CHARAN, I was a changed man, and the directional course of my life was forever altered. For the next few months, I visited with Johnny in the afternoon, just as he was closing up shop. We would talk for hours as the sun set across his window front. He would invariably stir cream and sugar into his cup of coffee and recollect stories about his beloved teacher. Johnny was an intensely emotional man, and during these talks he couldn't help tearing up as he remembered a certain thing CHARAN said, or the way his hands gestured. I too was caught up in this devotional atmosphere and passionately longed to get initiated, even though I was underage. I wrote a long letter to CHARAN expressing my wish to be initiated into Shabd yoga practice. After waiting a month or so and receiving no reply, I wrote again, even more wistfully. This time I did get a response, but it was from CHARAN's secretary, Professor Bhatnagar, wherein he rebuked me for asking for initiation since I was still a teenager and should wait until I at least turned 22 to apply. His letter seemed overly harsh and it bitterly stung, but it only made my resolve even firmer. Since I was only 17 at the time, 5 years seemed like a glacially long period to wait, but I was absolutely determined to do so. In one of life's nice ironies, 5 years later, Professor Bhatnagar got into some trouble when he lost a letter I had written to Charan Singh about my research work on Radhaswami and related offshoots. Charan very much wanted to respond to what I had written. It contained a message from Baba Fakir Chand that the old sage wanted me to convey and other specifics. Bhatnagar then telegrammed Roland de Vries, the Radhaswami Satsang Beas representative for the Western United States, and asked him to contact me directly so I could send a copy of the letter I had written, or, in the worst-case scenario, rewrite it and send it immediately to Charan Singh. Later, when I met with Professor Bhatnagar, he turned out to be very nice to me and even praised my research work on Paul Twitchell and Ekankar. If only I had known this would happen in the future, my keen sense of disappointment at the age of 17 would have been greatly lessened. During this period, I started attending satsang regularly and reading each and every book I could get my hands on that related to Sant Mat. I commenced meditating 30 to 60 minutes daily as well, repeating the mantra Radha Swami and attempting to be as still as possible. During one of my nighttime sittings, something dramatic transpired, and an intense numbness spread throughout my lower extremities, and I began leaving my body and felt I was going at a tremendous speed to an uncharted region. It was overwhelming, and I was certain that there existed another state of consciousness far beyond the waking state. But alas, I got scared and came back to my body, so I didn't let go for a deeper astral voyage. Of course, it can be rightly argued that the feeling of leaving one's body doesn't mean that one actually is. The brain has evolved to be a virtual simulator, and as such can conjure up all sorts of fantastic scenarios and confuse the would-be traveler into believing that what is purely subjective and open to multiple psychological interpretations is an exterior and objective glimpse of other worlds. It was an exhilarating experience that left me wanting more. It also prompted me to write another letter to Charan, informing him what happened and explaining that it was clear that I should get initiated right away on the basis of it. Charan wrote me 2 letters in response, one very sweet and one sterner. Both changed me for the better. First, Charan instructed me in one sentence about what kind of spiritual practice I should engage in for the next 5 years, and even beyond that. He wrote, and I quote him directly, This very longing is your meditation at present. And in his follow-up letter, he explained at length how easily the mind could deceive one into believing its own machinations. While not discounting my elevated sojourn, he wisely cautioned for me to not make much of it, and also to be more skeptical and critically minded. Each of these admonitions has served as touchstones for my thinking and for my meditations. I continued my meditation and read almost everything I could that was related to Sant Mat, Shabd Yoga, and Radhaswami. I also kept up my correspondence with Charan, though I knew better not to pester him too much for initiation until I reached 22 years old. London, England, summer 1976. It so happened that when I turned 20, word spread throughout the United States that Charan Singh was going to visit London, England during the summer and gave an open invitation for Americans to attend. The moment I heard word that even Sikhs, those not yet initiated, were allowed to attend the meetings, I arranged my flight and hotel room accordingly. Thankfully, the local Sangat had booked a charter flight from Los Angeles, California, with a brief stop in Bangor, Maine, onwards to London, England. My anxiety had no bounds. I had never been to Europe, but in my mind I only cared about having the first sight, what Indians call darshan, of my guru. The morning of the flight, however, turned out to be something of a disaster. That very morning I had wrenched my neck in the shower and had a knot the size of a baseball pinching my upper back. So my first transatlantic flight was tortuous, as I felt partially paralyzed. Yet such was my keenness to see Charan that I tried to explain it as burning karma away, and that it was all meant to be. I realize that karma theory is invoked by many to help explain those events in life that appear inexplicable. My own bias today is to avoid invoking karma and other metaphysical rationalizations and say instead that chance or probability or my own stupidity is at play. London that summer was unseasonably hot, but it didn't impact me as much as others since I was used to the summer heat of Southern California. Charan Singh was to give his first satsang at Earl's Court Stadium, a large indoor exhibition hall which had just months prior been the target of a terrorist bombing by the Provisional IRA. I vividly remember visiting the hall the night before his scheduled satsang. There were tens of Indian sevadars working on the platform and arranging the sound system. At one point, the sevadars looked at me and shouted excitedly, "Come on up and sit on the dais that Maharaj Ji will be giving satsang." Being a bit shy and not sure what to do, I stood there immobile until another sevadar slightly pushed me to take the climb, up which I happily did. I got a bird's-eye view of what Maharaji would see the next day. It was a moving moment for me as I could sense the love and devotion of the many workers. That next day, I went early to the satsang and got a seat in the stands next to an old initiate of Jagat Singh's, Len Duval. Jagat Singh, 1884 to 1951, was the successor of Sawan Singh. Shortly before his death, Jagat shocked Charan Singh by appointing him as his successor. Jagat Singh's tenure as the spiritual leader at Beos only lasted 3 years, but he initiated thousands within that time and had a huge impact on how to present the teachings in a clear and scientific format. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and it was the first time I heard shabds being sung in sweet, longing anticipation for their guru's arrival. This was joined by thousands in the audience who knew the Punjabi songs by heart. Right in the midst of this devotional singing, Charan appeared on stage. I wish I could describe in vivid detail what I felt at that moment, but words fail me since I was completely transfixed by his appearance. He proceeded to slowly look around the auditorium, looking from left to right at the vast crowd that had assembled. After about 5 or 10 minutes, he began his discourse in Punjabi, elaborating on the teachings of previous sants. I distinctly recall hearing 2 words over and over again as they have implanted themselves in my mind ever since: Shabt and Nam. Charan was emphasizing the practice of remembrance and going within to hear the sound current. The satsang lasted almost 2 hours. Even though I understood only 10 or so words, I sat transfixed the entire time. The following day, Charan gave satsang again at Earl's Court, but he was not scheduled to give another talk until the following weekend. That very Monday, I found myself wandering the streets of London, thinking about how much I enjoyed seeing Charan, and feeling a bit sad that it would be 5 days until I could see him again. Since I wasn't much of a tourist then, I was just walking, more or less aimlessly, down Queen's Way, when an older Indian woman, who I had never met before, came rushing by me, saying under her breath something about Maharaj Ji. I don't know why, but I sensed that she knew something about Charan's whereabouts, so I slowly followed her, keeping about 100 yards behind. Finally, I came to a park where there were a number of Sikhs, and the older woman came up to me and said, "Do you know where Maharaj Ji is?" I said, "I haven't a clue." Then an Indian man introduced himself and said, "The master is giving Nam, initiation into the path, in the hall across the street. Just wait and you will have his darshan when he comes out." I couldn't believe my luck, as I was the only American at that time in the park. Then, in a rush of excitement, I noticed a score of Indians, many of whom were Sikhs, gathering at the front of the park. Even the birds seemed to be aware that something was about to happen as they rushed out of the trees. Charan then gracefully exited from Porchester Hall, and I caught a beautiful glimpse of him, impeccably dressed in white, wearing a perfectly tied cream-coloured turban. Today the memory is frozen in my mind's eye, though he was probably standing on the sidewalk for barely a minute until he got into the car that was waiting for him and driven away. Later that evening, when I told Len Duval and others what had happened, they were amazed at my good luck, since none of them were even aware that he was so close by our hotel. The encounter only made me more anxious to see Charan the following weekend, where he was going to give an English discourse followed by questions from the audience. The English meetings were a delightful affair, and I got a closer look at Charan and how he interacted with his many disciples. What struck me most forcefully, and has directly influenced my own teaching career, was how calmly and reasonably Charan handled critical questions. There was one instance that stood out. One questioner was deeply angry with Charan Singh and proceeded to berate the Guru for nearly 7 or 8 minutes, complaining about his troubles with meditation. Some in the audience wanted the man to stop talking and sit down, but Charan didn't allow this and let him continue his harangue. All the while, I noticed that Charan didn't take offense in the least, and it appeared that the more belligerent the questioner became, the calmer and more serene Charan appeared. This profoundly impressed me, and I would later hear Charan on many occasions say very sincerely that critics are our best friends, and we should listen carefully to what they have to say, since they can often show us the errors of our ways. Charan was in his 60th year when I first saw him, and I had just turned 20 years old, still too young to receive initiation. After that trip to London, I became somewhat obsessed with Radhaswami history, which had first been sparked by reading Marvin Henry Harper's book, Gurus, Swamis and Avatars, that went into some details about the different lineages on Radhaswami. I suspect that my growing interest in Guru succession was partially due to my father's untimely death at the age of 52 when I was only 17. I was keenly aware of how temporary life is, and given Charan's advancing age, it made me all the more concerned that nothing was for certain. Although I was enamored with Charan long before I saw him, after London my attachment grew exponentially, and I felt a deep, yet sweet, longing to be in his presence. During my junior year in college, a very fortuitous event happened in my life that would forever alter my personal life and my academic career. At California State University, Northridge, I took a class on cults and sects with Professor Howard Happ. One of the books that we were assigned to read was by Robert S. Elwood, who was then Bashford Professor of Oriental Studies at the University of Southern California, USC, my father's old alma mater. As part of the course requirement, I wrote an extensive term paper on Eckankar, a new religious movement founded by Paul Twitchell in 1965. After Eckankar threatened me with a lawsuit if I published my research, I reached out to a number of academics, including Professor Elwood, who very kindly called me at home and invited me to his office at USC. We met a few days later and discussed the life and work of Paul Twitchell. At one point in our conversation, Professor Elwood told me about the historical work that Professor Mark Juergensmeyer at the University of California, Berkeley, was doing on Radhaswami. He suggested that I call him and gave me his office number. I called Professor Juergensmeyer that very afternoon, and I was fortunate to get a hold of him, since he was usually not there that late in the day. I explained my situation, and he very kindly invited me to visit him at his home in the Berkeley Hills. I drove up the following weekend, and we had an immediate rapport and discussed the various ins and outs of Radhaswami history. To my great surprise and joy, Professor Juergensmeyer asked me if I could serve as his research assistant on his upcoming trip to North India, since he needed someone with my knowledge and background to travel throughout the Punjab and compile an exhaustive genealogical tree of differing branches of the growing movement. I think one of the reasons that Professor Juergensmeyer wanted me as his research assistant was because I brought up a suitcase filled with obscure books on Radhaswami that I had collected over the past year or so, but which were not readily available in America. I remember opening the suitcase and showing him first editions of Julian Johnson's Call of the East and hard-to-find texts from Swami Bagh and elsewhere. Ironically, 40 years later, Professor Juergensmeyer and I were contracted by Oxford University Press to complete an annotated bibliography on Radhaswami, detailing various texts on the history and theology of the movement. He also informed me that there was going to be an international conference on the Sant tradition at the University of California, Berkeley, with distinguished scholars from around the world planning on attending, including the great Sikh scholar W. H. MacLeod and the famed Kabir expert Charlotte Vaudeville. It was from this conference that I learned how much Radhaswami was indebted to the Sant tradition, and that the practice of Sharpt yoga grew out of such nirguna bhakti poets as Namdev, Kabir, Dadu, Paltu Sahib, and others. North India, summer, 1978. I was terribly excited to go to India for the first time, but given my youth and immaturity, I was unprepared for what the trip had in store for me. My first job when I arrived in India was to go and stay at Sawan Ashram in Old Delhi, where one of the successors to Kirpal Singh was residing. His name was Thakar Singh, and as future events would abundantly make clear, he was a gravely disturbed human being who systematically abused others under his care. I arrived at Sawan Ashram early in the morning, and I was not ready for the intense heat and humidity. I was given my own room at the center, since at that time it was nearly empty. Thakar and I didn't get along during that week. It was obvious, at least to me, that Thakar was chosen by Madam Hardevi so that she could retain her administrative duties and a controlling interest in the ashram. Thakar Singh was subservient to Madam Hardevi and not vice versa, not something one would expect in Sant Mat circles, where the guru is given such an exalted status. My stay at the ashram was checkered by my disdain for Thakar Singh and his nefarious ways. Since I am intending this book to be a remembrance of Charan and not a recollection of my critical studies on new religious movements and their founders, I don't want to dwell too much on Thakar Singh and his ethical lapses. I will merely point out that a number of his own disciples, not me, are his harshest critics for how he treated women and children. For a more thorough analysis, see Chapter 5 of The Radha Swami Tradition, New York and London, Garland Publishers, 1992. We simply didn't get along, and one night we almost came to blows. I was sitting in Thakar's personal office and we were discussing historical matters related to Kirpal Singh, which is precisely why I was there, when Thakar interrupted my line of academic questioning and point-blank insisted that I take initiation from him. I looked directly at him in disbelief, since he already knew that I was planning on getting initiated later that year by Charan Singh, and my only reason for staying at his ashram was to gather more genealogical information for my professor's future book project. It got so heated that both Thakar and I stood up, exchanging impassioned words at each other. At one point I actually thought we were going to get into a physical altercation. Thankfully, my steadfast refusal to accept Thakar's persistent request that I take initiation from him eventually resolved itself, and if I remember correctly, that was the last time we ever talked. Later, after I had left Sawan Ashram, Thakar confessed to Professor Mark Jorgensmeyer, who showed up a few days later, that I don't think your research assistant enjoyed his stay very much. I mention this unpleasant episode because it led to something that made my first trip to India one of the most memorable of my life. Prior to arriving in India, I had written to Radha Swami Satsang Beas headquarters in Beas, known more simply amongst Satsangis as the Dera, where Charan lived most of the year, asking permission if I could stay for a week or so. The secretary wrote me back and in no uncertain terms explained that the Dera didn't allow Westerners in the summer, and thus was told there were no accommodations for me to reside there during that time. However, during my stay with Thakar Singh, I was quite sick. I had contracted a bad case of amoebic dysentery, most likely from the unsanitary conditions that were prevalent at the time at Sawan Ashram, and wrote a letter to Charan informing him about what was happening and how troubling it was to see how Thakar treated his wife and how the atmosphere at the ashram was extremely tense. The book, compiled and edited by Malcolm Tillis, entitled The Emergence of the New Master, published in 1975, provides a harrowing glimpse of the ugly politics that surrounded the death of Kirpal Singh and why Sawan Ashram in particular had become so dilapidated. For example, Bhagwan Gyaniji, one-time secretary to Kirpal Singh, was still living at the ashram when I visited there. Yet, he was so afraid of the quarrelsome nature of Madam Devi, Thakar Singh and others in charge that he was extremely reticent to talk at length with me, in fear that what he had to say would leak out and he would get booted from his home. I explained that I was planning on visiting Baba Fakir Chand, a renowned sage in the lineage of Shivbrat Lal and Rai Saligram in Hoshiarpur, in a week or so, and after that would be attending satsang at Beas, if all worked out well. Since I was getting my mail from the American Express office in Connaught Circle, I didn't always receive timely replies to my various queries, so I never got Charan's response until a month or so later, wherein he informed me that I was most welcome to stay at the Dera during the Bandara held later in July. Not sure if I was going to be allowed to stay at the Dera, I planned to take a bus from Amritsar daily to attend Charan's morning satsang. But in the interval, I had received a telegram from Baba Fakir Chand to come direct from Delhi by train to his ashram Manavta Mandir in Hoshiarpur, which is nestled in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. Though I was overly anxious to see Charan, I realized I had to wait a week or so because meeting and interviewing Fakir Chand was one of the key priorities of the research trip. Meeting Fakir was a magical experience in many ways, not the least of which was how many odd coincidences occurred along the way. Baba Fakir Chand. I first learned of Baba Fakir Chand in the fall of 1977 when I was looking through the card catalogues at the UCLA Research Library for my genealogical work on the Radhaswami tradition. I found an obscure book by Seth Akal Singh entitled World Religious Conference, Delhi, 1957, listed under the unclassified section. After tracing the book, I noticed it contained two striking pictures. The first was of Pratap Singh, the then-current Sat Guru of the Namdari Sikhs, and the second one was of Fakir Chand. I immediately surmised that this Fakir must be the same one mentioned in Agam Prasad Mathur's Radhaswami Faith, a historical study that I had read earlier. I subsequently wrote to the sage, wondering if he was still alive. The only address I had was Manavta Mandir, Hoshiarpur, North India. To my joyful surprise, in less than 4 weeks I received a letter from Fakir Chand along with 3 books, including one entitled Light on the Anand Yog, written by his guru, Shivbrat Lal Varman. 7 months of continuous correspondence followed. Finally, I asked Fakir if I could visit him when I came to India in the summer of 1978. Fakir kindly agreed to my request, cabling me to come direct from Delhi when I arrived in India. I still vividly remember my first trip to Hoshiarpur. I stood in the crowded Delhi train station trying to figure out how I could secure passage on the train when an Indian gentleman behind me asked me about my travel plans. I hesitated, thinking that he would know nothing about Fakir or the Bee-Man temple. I was wrong. When I mentioned the saint and my destination, his face lit up and he said excitedly, "My grandmother is a great devotee of Fakir's. In fact, the guru will attend my sister's wedding in a few days. I will cancel my earlier train ride so I can go with you and guide your way." Although I never did meet the mysterious gentleman again, he did help me arrange my passage and told me something of the interesting city of Hoshiarpur, which is near the foothills of the Himalayas. After an 8-hour train ride through the night to Hoshiarpur, I took a bicycle rickshaw from the train station to Manavta Mandir. The scent of the morning air and the lingering dawn light through the clouds had a strange impact on me. I felt as if I had entered a forgotten homeland. An odd sense of déjà vu affected me. I spotted a photograph of Fakir Chand inside the entranceway that immediately caught my eye. Why does he look so familiar to me? I pondered to myself. Then, at the moment of my arrival, an old devotee of Fakir's enthusiastically greeted me, saying, "We have been expecting you. You have come on a most auspicious occasion, Guru Purnima Day." I was immediately surrounded by a number of Indians who were eager for me to have the darshan of Fakir, who was then in deep samadhi. At first glance, Fakir Chand did indeed seem completely unconscious of this world, but when I bowed in front of him, he rose up, fully awake, and hit me on the back strongly with his hand, giving me an affectionate welcome. Fakir's Bee-Man temple was unique. Instead of just pictures of gurus who belonged to Fakir's direct lineage, there were photographs of masters from almost all of the Radhaswami lineages, including a huge colour portrait of Sawan Singh, the late Gade Nashin at Beas. Adorning the end of the hall was a life-size statue of Fakir Chand's guru Maharishi Shivbrat Lal. After a little rest, I was invited to attend Fakir's morning satsang that was held outside due to the large crowd. The Sevadars in charge kindly gave me a chair to sit on, since I was not used to sitting cross-legged. I can never forget Fakir's animated expressions during the satsang. As the crowd was singing shabds, hymns of devotion, Fakir, with his eyes closed, would swing his hands as if conducting a concert. Then, after the completion of the shabds, Fakir spoke in Hindi about various aspects of Sant Mat. Surprisingly, given my limited knowledge of the language, I understood the gist of Fakir Chand's discourse, one which is echoed throughout his writings. When I came to this line as a guru, my eyes were opened. Why? Because those who regard me as their master, my image appears to them in their meditation, in their dreams, and even in their state of wakefulness, and guides them, whereas I remain unaware of all this. A lady sent me a letter stating that she was having a bath in a river in Kashmir. Suddenly, she records, a wave of water came and took her away for 10 or 15 yards. She writes that when she was drowning, I appeared there, caught her hand, and brought her out of the river, and said, "You have yet to do a lot of work." She has written to me so as to know what work she is to do. Now, neither did I go there to save her, nor did I tell her that she has yet to do a lot of work. This is the secret. Later that same afternoon, I had a personal interview with Fakir Chand, which lasted several hours. Although Fakir's native language was Hindi, Urdu, he spoke fluent English, so there was no need for a translator. I asked Fakir a number of questions which related to guru succession, i.e., how many other disciples besides yourself served as gurus after Shiv Brat Lal's death. But he kept turning the discussion to a more personal side, asking me about my own meditation practice, ethical life, and so forth. Fakir was eager to share the gist of his own quest so that my own spiritual journey may be smoother. I had the sense, during our conversation, that I could ask any question that I wanted. One impression that has always stayed with me about Fakir Chand was his remarkable unpretentiousness. Despite his Brahmin caste, Fakir appeared to treat each and every individual as his dear son or daughter. In my case, due to my young age, 22 years old at the time, Fakir called me a son, rather a grandson. His obvious warm regard and affection endeared him to me almost immediately. Fakir and I soon became fast friends. Each day he would talk with me for 2 or 3 hours about his spiritual realizations. One morning, however, was quite special. The old sage was lying down on his back in samadhi with a white sheet over him. For all practical purposes, at least to those devotees sitting next to him, Fakir Chand was out of his body, enjoying the bliss of higher inner regions. I was sitting in a Western-style chair in quiet observation when, to my astonishment, Fakir descended from his contemplative state, pulled down the sheet covering him, and looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I want to speak with you." What followed was one of the most penetrating and enlightening discourses I have ever heard. For, unlike most gurus in India, Fakir Chand revealed in detail the secret behind many inner visions and miracles. Now, you see, no Jesus Christ comes from without in anybody's visions. No Rama, no Krishna, no Buddha, and no Baba Fakir comes from without to anybody. The visions are only because of the impressions and suggestions that a disciple has already accepted in his mind. These impressions and suggestions appear before him like a dream. Nobody comes from without. This is the plain truth. Look here. There is a woman. She has got a son. That child loves that lady as his mother. The child will have nothing in his mind against that lady. He will adore her, he will love her and respect her. The brother of that lady comes. He has different thoughts for her in his mind. When her husband meets her, he carries different feelings in his mind about her, and when a friend of that lady meets, his mind is different. From the same lady, different individuals get different types of love, affection, and adoration. So, whatever you have to gain, it is all with this faith and belief that your ideal is perfect. Whatever you gain it as per your own faith and belief. As a child gets motherly love from his mother, similarly, the husband gets a wife's love from the same lady. You always have this faith and firm belief that your guru is within you. Do not think him ever away from you in any human form. Guru is knowledge or correct understanding. It was during my numerous conversations with Fakir that I learned of his radical understanding of the truth of our existence. Although Fakir taught the practice of Surat Shabd Yoga, he also emphasized the importance of discrimination, Jnana Yoga. In a personal letter to me dated March 8, 1978, Fakir described the process for enlightenment. Whatever I have realized is that one should research his own self. Unless this is done, one cannot get peace. Nobody is in a position to know the secrecy of nature. I try to make a man realize himself. Know thyself by thyself. To realize one's own self, one has to penetrate within himself, leaving the physical, mental, and spiritual senses. And what will remain behind is thy own self, and that self is eternal. Visitor of body, mind, and spirit, that self is a part of the infinity which no one can know except he loses his own entity and merges himself in the reality which is named by different sects and religions by different names. Some call it Allah. Some call it nameless, formless, Akal, Anami, Ram, or Radhaswami. Try to penetrate within yourself. Leave physical senses by repeating holy name given to you by your guru without moving your tongue. Meditate on the image of your guru. Concentration on the image is necessary for leaving mental vibrations. Then comes light and sound. Try to know what is that who sees light within or listens to sound within. Then one can realize who he is. His search ends, and one becomes the same reality. During my stay at Manavta Mandir, I had the opportunity to closely observe Fakir Chand and some of his personal habits. I noticed the following. 1. Fakir Chand did not live at Manavta Mandir, but made his residence in a small abode several blocks away from the ashram. 2. Fakir arrived very early in the morning at Manavta Mandir, usually in a bicycle rickshaw. 3. Fakir would go into samadhi, deep meditation, every day, and his followers would sit around him, also meditating. 4. Fakir Chand's withdrawal of consciousness was such that only the whites of his eyes would be visible. 5. Fakir smoked a hookah, a water pipe filled with tobacco, in the afternoon, at which time he would also go through his correspondence. 6. Fakir was of small stature, though his health was exceptional for a man in his 90s. 7. At times, Fakir's eyes would look as if they were deep ocean blue, and at other times hazel brown. 8. Fakir attracted a number of highly educated disciples, including university professors, lawyers, judges, and doctors. Devotees of other gurus respected Fakir's satsangs. I noticed that Fakir Chand had admirers from Beas, Agra, Delhi, Tarn, and other Sant Mat centers, several of whom I personally interviewed. Looking back now, 40 years later, meeting Fakir was a turning point in my first trip to India, since in the weeks prior I had felt overwhelmed by the heat, poverty, and the terrible impression I had of Thakkar and other gurus I had met. Fakir was decidedly different. He was exceedingly honest, open, and candid. Fakir was also insightfully clear about doing away with the mythological thinking surrounding mysticism. Even though I had a delightful stay at Manavta Mandir and a deep rapport with Fakir Chand, I was very anxious to see Charan Singh. I distinctly remember trying to figure a way to abbreviate my visit in Hoshiarpur so I could attend satsang at Beas. Fakir too sensed this in me, as well as very kindly told me that I was free to leave, but was adamant that my devotional ideas, young and wide-eyed as they were then, would change over time. Indeed, he even went so far as to make a little prophecy about me that, perhaps not surprisingly, turned out to be right on the mark, as I recounted in the book about Fakir's life, The Unknowing Sage. The last day of my stay with Baba Fakir Chand is engraved upon my heart. Fakir was lying down in a back room when I was ushered in to pay my farewell respects. The old master took my face in his hands, looked intensely into my eyes, and reiterated what he had said upon my arrival. "You are like my son, rather a grandson. I wish you to be practical in your life. There are two schools of thought. The aim of one school is to bring people into its circle. They bring people into their church, but I remove people from the church also. To be born in a church is a blessing, but to die in church is a curse. You cannot fully understand my views as yet because you have to do a lot of work in your worldly life as yet. The present devotional ideas which you have now will change after some years, and then, in your old age, you will come to this line. This is my prophecy about you." Fakir also gave me a personal message to convey to Charan Singh, for whom he had the highest respect. I then handed over a 100 rupee note to Fakir to pay for my accommodations. He looked quizzically at me and remarked, "Why so much?" I then said it wasn't too much at all, given how well I have been treated. Fakir then immediately had a worker at the ashram come in, and he handed over the note and said that a receipt must be given to me for that amount. Fakir refused to accept any money for himself, and thus my pitiful sum was given as a donation to Manavta Mandir. I emphasize this point since Fakir, unlike any other gurus I have met, refused to even stay at his own center, since he felt it was not right to take such a luxury. One time when Fakir was too sick to leave the ashram, he insisted on paying for his overnight stay. The next morning, after visiting the famous Bhrigu Samhita, an ancient astrological treatise, I took a crowded bus to Amritsar, the sacred city of the Sikhs. I remember the butterflies in my stomach and the joy I felt when the bus drove over the Beas River Bridge and I could get a glimpse of the glistening minarets of the Dera's Satsang Gar, where my guru Charan resided. I wanted the bus to stop right there and then, but it couldn't, and travelled for another 30 or so miles to its destination. Because I had not received official permission to stay at the Dera, I decided I would find a cheap youth hostel and spend 2 or so weeks commuting via bus to Beas for the morning satsang. The Dera. Each morning I would wake up around 5:30 a.m. and, after showering, walk a mile or so to the local bus stop and take it to the small town of Beas. Due to several bus stops, it usually took about an hour and a half to reach our destination. I would then disembark and either walk or take a rickshaw to the Dera colony. Once I arrived, I tried to get a decent seat among the thousands who had gathered for the morning talk. Charan would arrive punctually at the appointed time and either give a discourse for about an hour and a half based on earlier sants, or he would sit and give darshan as another appointed sevadar gave the satsang. It was utterly delightful for me, and I felt as if I had come home. Everyone was very nice, and the atmosphere was saturated with a deep sense of devotion and respect. After satsang, I would invariably buy some chai and a bowl of chana masala, both of which were so tasty that I soon became addicted to this daily ritual. I took the morning bus from Amritsar to the Dera for 13 straight days. I would usually return back to the youth hostel around noon or so. Having the afternoon free, I would play soccer with the local kids or visit the splendid Golden Temple of the Sikhs. The only real difficulty I had taking the bus was that one had to sit on a metal seat without any cushion, so being too skinny in those days, my bum would be bruised by the end of the bumpy ride. To remedy the situation, I started taking my pillow with me and sitting on that. I can still remember the funny looks I got from my fellow Sikh bus riders, but a few thought it was a clever accommodation on my part. At the end of my 13th day journeying on the bus, after leaving the morning satsang and walking to get my morning chai, a British woman who was staying at the Dera at the time came up to me and queried why I was taking the bus every day and going back to Amritsar. I replied that I had to, since I hadn't received permission to stay in the colony. She looked quizzically at me for a moment or two and then said, "Well, that is odd, since your name is on the guest house register, and it even lists the room that has been assigned to you." I was, naturally, surprised by the news, and hoping she was right, immediately went to visit the secretary of the Dera. The elderly Indian gentleman, if memory serves me correctly, I think it was Mr. Sondi, informed that, "Yes, you definitely have permission to stay here. We have been expecting you this past week. Wasn't taking the bus daily taxing?" I replied that it was well worth the trouble, but that I was very happy to stay put at the Dera for the next week. Much has been written about the beauty of Dera Baba Jaimal Singh, which is about 3 miles proper from the Beos train station. In the summer of 1978, it still had an old town charm to it, since the road in and out was bedecked with all sorts of old school conveyances. When I finally got to stay at the Dera, I was joined by Professor Mark Juergensmeyer a day or so later. We shared a room, and each day we would visit with various administrative heads at the Dera. I particularly remember having deep conversations with Professor K.S. Narang, who was the former Vice-Chancellor of Punjabi University and then head of the Dera's Publications Department. We became friends, though later he would chastise me for doing too many books and articles which he deemed controversial, particularly if they related to Radhaswami's checkered history or the late Baba Fakir Chand. Several distinct moments stand out for me during that Dera visit. First was when I was sitting in the morning satsang listening to Charan's sweet and even-keel voice discussing a shabd, when a torrential rainstorm hit and the entire Sangat got drenched. It was actually a welcome relief, since it has been incredibly hot and humid just moments before. I was impressed that nobody got up to leave, even though it was a massive downpour. Even Charan was getting wet, but continued as if nothing unusual had occurred. It was the most refreshing rain I had ever felt. Second, I was lucky to see Charan up close when he would sit quietly during Mani Seva. Since I was the only American there at the time, I was allowed to place myself just to the side of the dais, perhaps no more than 10 feet away from my guru. Occasionally, Charan would glance down at me, probably wondering what I was doing there, fanning myself in the heat. Yet such a simple moment was a joyous occasion, and I realized then and there that just having his darshan made me feel supremely content, as I was precisely where I should be. The highlight of the trip was when Professor Mark Juergensmeyer arranged to have a personal interview with Charan Singh and asked me to accompany him. I was beyond nervous but excited to have this rare opportunity, especially since I had not been formally accepted for initiation. Intellectually speaking, in the days prior I felt like the odd man out at the Dera, since only being a research assistant, I felt that my ideas on Radhaswami history were not taken seriously, despite the fact that Mark regarded me as even more knowledgeable on the subject than himself. Yet Charan Singh, at the very beginning of the interview, made a funny, offhand remark that immediately eradicated my self-conscious and immature insecurity. Charan, looking directly at Mark and then pointing at me, queried, "Are you sure that David is not the professor and you, Mark, the research assistant?" I laughed and immediately corrected Charan's sweet teasing and said, "Oh no, Maharajji, Mark is the professor. I am just his assistant." It was a simple gesture, no doubt, but in jesting I felt much more relaxed in Charan's presence. For the next hour, Mark and Charan had an informal conversation, ranging from acquaintances and friends they had in common, the Khanna family in particular, to the future plans of the Dera. Charan talked at length about his desire to build a hospital in the town of Beos, which would serve anyone free of charge. They also discussed the annual eye camp, where thousands of people could have no-cost surgery to remove their cataracts and other ailments. Joining in our meeting was Professor Janak Raj Puri, who seemed delighted to be part of the proceedings, even though he and Charan had long been friends. Given my awe and respect for Charan, I dared not say a word, but I was so happy to just be there that I soaked it all in, knowing too well that such an intimate gathering was exceptional, since there were over 1 million followers in Radhaswami. After the meeting, I got a chance to visit with Janak Raj Puri at his home. We discussed Sant Mat history and related subjects. As I was leaving, I thought it might be prudent to give a copy of my newly finished senior thesis to Professor Puri, since it focused on how Paul Twitchell, the founder of Ekankar, had relied heavily on Radhaswami teachings, even going so far as to plagiarize large portions of his writings without attribution from Julian P. Johnson's 2 most famous texts, With a Great Master in India and The Path of the Masters. This turned out to be a wise move on my part, since after Puri read the manuscript, he gave the copy to Charan Singh for him to read. I was, to say the very least, pleasantly surprised when I heard word from Charan that he and others on his staff had read it thoroughly and thought it was well researched. Later, when the paper was published as a book, the Dera asked that copies be sent to all of the Western representatives of Radhaswami Satsang Beos. On the very last day of my stay at the Dera, I got violently sick. I had made the mistake of eating some fried pakoras from one of the street vendors and stupidly ate far too many since they were especially tasty. I ended up getting amoebic dysentery. I had gotten sick earlier when staying in Delhi with Thakkar Singh, but this time it was much worse, and when I got to Delhi, I got the chance to see a Harvard-trained physician who prescribed me some powerful antibiotics. During this time, I was pretty much laid up and, thankfully, was fortunate to stay in the plush diplomatic enclave at Professor Ainsley Embry's home. Professor Embry was serving at the Council for Cultural Affairs at the American Embassy in New Delhi, and his beautiful home became a haven for visiting intellectuals and scholars. It was here where I got the chance to meet Ved Mehta, the famous Indian novelist who has been blind since childhood. As I was recuperating, I started to get anxious about not utilizing my time properly. I keenly remember one afternoon reading a Sant Bani magazine that detailed the life story of Ajaib Singh, one of the reputed successors of the late Kirpal Singh. Knowing that Ajaib was planning on coming to Delhi that very afternoon, I got out of bed and took a bicycle rickshaw to the home of Papu, whose family were devotees of the Guru. It turned out to be a very pleasant visit, since Ajaib, though he didn't speak English, was much nicer and easier to be with than Thakkar Singh. Once, when he was giving satsang at a home not too far away from Papu's, there was no room for me to sit, so instead they had me sit right next to Ajaib, leaning up against him as he gave his informal talk. Later I saw Ajaib drink a Kampa Cola in almost one gulp and give out a satisfying burp. Given my fondness for Coca-Cola, I could appreciate his obvious enjoyment, particularly given the heat and the humidity. Ajaib also gave me a huge dollop of prasad on a banana leaf, much more than anyone else's probably, because I was young and much taller than anyone in attendance. Although I enjoyed my time with Ajaib, it made me all the more anxious to be with Charan, for whom my singular devotion was such that anything that reminded me of him, whether it be visiting another Shabd yogi or eating Indian food or reading a spiritual book, generated a longing to go back to the Dera. I was, of course, very young and very naive. But bhakti is such a strong force, and one that, though at times appearing irrational, can generate the sweetest feelings of bliss imaginable. Although it should be noted that intertwined with this bliss is a pain so cutting that it feels as if one's entire being is getting torn asunder. Paradoxical as it may seem, the bhakti-filled devotee enjoys the longing and the pain because it provides a unique feeling of joy that is unlike anything else. The feeling and the pull of such love is so powerful and so enticing that it is impossible to describe it in a sensible and rational way. It is the deepest and most penetrating type of love that I have ever experienced. It is transcendent for those under its spell. I ended up leaving India earlier than expected, since my illness had taken a toll on my body. I knew, however, that I would come back as soon as I could. Initiation, November 26, 1978. It was a long 5-year wait, and one that saw me increasingly anxious. But in hindsight, I now see the overall wisdom behind why CHARAN made me and others wait until I reached the age of 22 to apply for initiation. CHARAN used to say that one should resist, resist, and resist some more before committing to the 4 vows which are inviolate in Sant Mat: vegetarianism, no alcohol or drugs, high moral living, and 2.5 hours of meditation daily. He would often say that one could spend their whole life researching the path to make certain that this was the right course of action, and it would not be time wasted, but actually time gained. CHARAN had a very long view on life's varied trajectories and was never anxious to initiate anyone, since he realized how difficult it was to actually stay on the straight and narrow, particularly, I would imagine, for Westerners, steeped in a culture of hedonism and materialism. Surprisingly, there is nothing really secret or new in the formal initiation. I had learned of the mantra of 5 names from a close reading of certain Sant Mat books. The sitting posture for bhajan is also widely known and is even pictured in various books on yoga. But what made me most happy was that I could now fully commit to the interior quest. I received the meditation instructions from Roland G. de Vries, who served as a proxy initiator for Charan Singh. Roland and I had corresponded for several years, and we had talked several times about Sant Mat. He was an ex-Christian minister and often gave heartwarming talks about the spiritual journey. His voice was unique and had a southern, soothing charm. The initiation ceremony lasted about 3 hours and was conducted at his home in Riverside, California. As I drove home that afternoon, I felt a deep sense of relief coupled with a newfound excitement. Finally, I reflected to myself, the inner adventure in meditation can begin in earnest. All I wanted to do was go home, practice repeating the 5 names, and listen to the inner sound current. I was supremely happy and contented. To be continued. End Part 1. Appendix. Select letters. Personal letters from Charan Singh, Gurinder Singh. Radha Swami Satsang Beas, Punjab, India, May 1990. Michelle Lopez, 11364 East Byways Street, South El Monte, California, 91733, USA. Dear brother, I have received your letter of April 24th. I am glad you feel interested in Sant Mat teachings. You should read some books on the subject. There are so many. Your Professor David Lane will be able to guide you. You are still young and a student. There is plenty of time at your disposal. I would, however, not like you to neglect your studies. Your career is an important matter. Regarding your problem of finding the right true master, your own heart will guide you at the right time. There is always a time for certain momentous decisions in the life of a person. Your study of Saint Marthe, your understanding of the philosophy, will help you in your search. The seeker's mind automatically feels a certain satisfaction and inner contentment on coming across some mystic, and he feels drawn towards him. Time will resolve this problem for you. With good wishes, yours affectionately, Charan Singh. The master passed away before he could sign this letter. Radha Swami Satsang Beas, Punjab, India, 20th July 1990. Miss Michelle M. Lopez, 11364 East Byways Street, South El Monte, California, 91733, USA. Dear Sister, thanks for your letter of 21st June. Your desire for initiation is noted. However, you should have acted on the advice of Hazur Maharaj Ji in his letter of May and contacted your college professor, David Lane. Professor Lane has a deep understanding of Saint Marthe and will be very helpful. Initiation is a momentous occasion in life, and a decision in this regard should be taken after great thought and consideration. We should not act in a hurry. Please do not despair. The Lord does not forsake those who love him. With good wishes, yours affectionately, G.S. Dillon. Radhaswami Satsang Beas, 8 September, 74. Mr. David C. Lane, 11632 Blitt Street, North Hollywood, California, 91602, USA. Dear brother, I am glad to receive your letter of 6 August. I very much appreciate your love and devotion and your keen desire for initiation, but it is always better to accept the advice that is given. It is in your own interest. It is in no way to discourage you or anyone when the age limit is brought to one's notice. There is a purpose in that. One can be emotionally moved in certain matters, but when the time for practice comes, then there is trouble and difficulty. The mind and the intellect give no peace. This very longing is your meditation at present. You are not wasting your time, but are building a firm foundation. Keep up this longing and let it grow. Live the Saint Marthe way of life and do not worry. There is no harm in waiting for the right age. With best wishes, yours affectionately, Charan Singh. Radhaswami Satsang Beas, Punjab, India, March 16, 1979. My dear David, I hope you have heard from Mr. De Vries requesting you to send a copy of your long letter you sent to the Master, in which you gave details of your visits to various Radhaswami centers, especially Agra, Hoshiarpur, and Taran. It was, I think, a 2-page typed letter. I do not know where it has been misplaced, and we have not been able to acknowledge it to you so far. The Master is anxious to have that letter and send you his reply. I hope you have already taken action on hearing from Mr. De Vries. I am every day looking for the mail to find that letter. It has not so far arrived. Will you please treat this matter as most urgent and send me a copy of that letter immediately? You must be having it with you, as the original you sent to the Master was a typed one. Awaiting an early action and thanking you with Radhaswami greetings. Yours sincerely, M.S. Bhatnagar. Mr. David C. Lane, 11632 Blix Street, North Hollywood, California, 91602, USA. Radhaswami Satsang Beas, Punjab, India, March 29, 1979. My dear brother, I am sorry your original letter got misplaced somewhere and could not be traced. Therefore you had to be inconvenienced to send us a copy to enable me to send you a reply, hence the delay. First, I would like to congratulate you on your marriage and initiation. Now that you are on the path for which you had been longing so much, I hope regular time will be devoted to meditation every day. This is the prime purpose of human life. The research you have made in the Radhaswami movement vis-à-vis the other movements was given to me by Mr. Narang, and I very carefully went through it. It is a very valuable research, beautifully presented. I can quite understand how much time and labor you must have spent upon it, going into such details. You have very carefully brought out the contradictions, which will be found very useful for all seekers. You have taken a very objective view in your entire research, and it has been read by many members of my staff too, and all find it very interesting and appreciate it very much. I showed it to Mr. De Vries when he was here at the Dera last. He also greatly appreciated the effort you have put in and the details into which you have gone. I am very glad that during your visit in India you got an opportunity of visiting different places and centres and found an opportunity to gain first-hand knowledge of all these places. Whatever talk you had with Baba Fakir Chand Ji Maharaj, I am glad it was all quite interesting. You should not worry if what he says is not rightly quoted. I seldom get any time to read all such books. Regarding the other movement, you have made a most interesting research, both objectively and subjectively, and the seekers will automatically take advantage of this constructive research. Undoubtedly, it has been a very laborious task you have been able to complete. With kind regards, yours affectionately, Charan Singh. Mr. David C. Lane, 520 Liberty Street, El Chorrito, California, 94530, USA.